Hi everyone, I'm just recording the second part of our lecture in week 8, just to make sure that we don't have to go too quickly during the lecture itself. So, as part of this week, we are going to look at how to deal with individual differences in skill acquisition. Now, this is absolutely huge because I think this is one of the main reasons why the constraints-led approach can be so beneficial for practitioners of any kind. So that can be sports coaches as well as physiotherapists, as well as physical education teachers, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and understand how the intrinsic dynamics of a learner can lead to either accelerated or decelerated skill acquisition, something that we've briefly touched upon before. Then we're also going to discuss which types of inter-individual differences usually exists within groups that you're going to be working with. We're going to touch on the role of genetics in skill acquisition just briefly, because genetics explain a large proportion of the inter-individual differences, especially at a young age. And then finally, we're going to look at how practitioners have already dealt with individual differences in skill acquisition. So, of course, we know that the human movement system has more degrees of freedom than it actually needs. So as long as a learner can control that multitude of degrees of freedom in any way possible, preferably with as much variability as possible, we say that someone has a flexible ability to perform a skill, right? They're adaptable and they're creative. So a functional level of variability always exists within the motor system to achieve a particular task goal, and we referred to that previously as functional movement solutions. So in essence, when we design learning environments for learners, what we're looking for is for each learner to be able to use a functional movement solution that matches their intrinsic dynamics within that session. So an individual level of analysis is hugely important if you want to understand skill acquisition. And it's also going to be very important for your peer instruction sessions. If you do not find a way of dealing with inter-individual differences that exist between your learners, or individual differences in skill acquisition, then likely, of course, your session is going to be marked at a lower degree. So we already talked about intrinsic dynamics of the movement system, and intrinsic dynamics really explain why it is possible for novices to be really good or to exhibit certain coordinated movements really successfully, even though they're just beginning learners, right? And we said before that that's related to the intrinsic dynamics of the learner. And when we say intrinsic dynamics, what we really mean is a set of individually unique movement capabilities that a learner brings with them when learning a new skill, right? If someone's learning how to type and they have plenty of experience on a typewriter for some reason, yet they've got intrinsic dynamics that would match the task of learning to type on a more modern keyboard. And of course, intrinsic dynamics are hugely affected by many constraints. Right? They're affected by someone's genetics, by someone's learning experience, by someone's environment, or someone's experience with a particular task. And you can think of it a little bit like moving house, right? When you move house, you might move to an entirely new apartment or an entirely new house. But when you're bringing the same furniture that you had beforehand, your house or your rooms are going to look reasonably similar. And intrinsic dynamics work in a very similar fashion. So you're taking baggage with you when you're learning a new task. And if you're taking experience with you, and that experience matches the dynamics of the new task, then learning might be accelerated. So what Bennett and David said was that the conditions under which coordination changes occur are hugely individual specific, because there are individual differences in intrinsic dynamics. And anyone who's worked with young learners has seen this, right? There are vast differences in how quickly young learners pick up new skills, and also vast differences in their baseline performance levels. So really we can say that individual or intrinsic dynamics are the building blocks upon which humans construct functional movement solutions. Let's say in this particular example, if one of these children is very gifted from a coordination perspective, then they are most likely going to use that advanced coordination to find other functional movement solutions than someone who might be more gifted in speed, right? So someone who's got intrinsic dynamics or who's faster is going to dribble in a different way than someone who's not as fast but has better coordination. So understanding intrinsic dynamics really understands why we have to provide individual learning environments from a constraints-led perspective. Because we've already said this, if the behavioral requirements of the task match the intrinsic dynamics of the learner, then there's accelerated learning. And when the intrinsic dynamics of a learner mismatch with the behavioral requirements of a task, then the learning is a lot slower. Of course, we can talk about intrinsic dynamics, but intrinsic dynamics is a relatively abstract concept, right? And one way in which we best understand individual differences is through the role of genetics. Because some individuals are absolute naturals, right? And they're more susceptible to training and to practice. So is there such a thing as a genetic predisposition to being a better learner or a better performer? And then we can use some research evidence for that, and studies in twins or twin studies have demonstrated that the influence of genetics on skill performance in a novel task is very high. Right? So there's some sort of genetic predisposition that allows you to perform a task really well the very first time you try it. Yeah? So when you're attempting a novel task. However, it must be said that in that particular study, they measured skill performance and not skill acquisition. So what others have found is that the genetic component diminishes as you practice more, and that makes sense, right? There's some sort of genetic predisposition that allows you to perform a task when you're an absolute novice, but then as you start practicing more, practice or the cultural or the nurture aspect wins out over the nature or the genetic aspect. So the genetic component diminishes over the course of practice. And there's plenty of geneticists that work around better understanding physical performance, and especially now that we've mapped the entire genome, understanding which genes are related to physical performance is actually not that difficult anymore. All right, so what most geneticists saw is that there's no single gene that's responsible for sports performance. Right? It's usually a combination of a combination of genes or genetic predispositions that allows you or that influence biological function. And it's likely also that different biological functions, right, cardiovascular endurance, soccer performance, the ability to do a handstand, etc., that they are all influenced by different combinations of these genes. So that basically refutes the idea that a single gene is responsible for athletic superiority. So there's no single gene that is a magic bullet for athletic performance. And unfortunately, a lot of the former Soviet Russian talent programs would have contradicted that, but we now know that there's no magic genetic bullet. So the presence of genetic material should not necessarily be viewed as a blueprint for success in sport. However, right, we all know that if someone's parents are hugely influential in sport or they're very good performers, it's usually an expectation that the children would also be athletically very gifted. And usually to some extent that's true, yeah, but not always do we see that same talent or giftedness in children than we do in parents. And of course, there's a huge cultural role that's played in sports performance. Right? If you imagine in Canada, ice hockey is the absolute number one sport, and ice skating is very frequent from a young age on, and not just for sports purposes, but also for locomotion. Right? The same in the Netherlands, where a lot of the lakes and waterways get flooded and frozen in winter, and sometimes people can ice skate for 70 kilometers, right, without having to stop. So in these countries, ice skating is very frequent. That means that usually the intrinsic dynamics of the learners already match the task requirements for ice skating. Right? Young children who start ice skating have already had some exposure or some experience to ice skating previously. The same thing when we look at running or distance running in Kenya, right? Kenyans genetically have long legs and a very slender body, usually quite low body fat percentage. They're used to training and living at very high altitudes, and it's very common for children to walk or to run distances between 5 and 20 kilometers, right? So here we see that there's an interaction between genes and cultural aspects, right? So again, the intrinsic dynamics for Kenyan people match the requirements of the task of running, and they've got an absolute superiority in long distance running. So that shows us that yes, genetics are somewhat important, but the cultural aspects that are related to how intrinsic dynamics match task dynamics in individuals are hugely important as well. And the great thing is that nowadays we've got amazing technology that helps us to study inter-individual differences. Right? And it's not just this particular study that uses a Vicon motion analysis system for assessing archery biomechanics, but it's also at UTS, for example. We've had a few studies that Libby ran a few consecutive years where they looked at the biomechanical analysis of cricket fast bowling, and I think one of the things that they saw was actually that there's even in expert performers, there's huge inter-individual differences in bowling biomechanics. So imagine what that's like at a much lower performance level, right? For example, with novices. And a few studies have actually looked at that, and they've compared different novices to each other, but also novices and more advanced performers. And in this particular study, they looked at the elbow velocity of a basketball set shot or a free throw. Right? And what they saw that yes, there is inter-individual differences for novices already. So if you look at the top versus the middle analysis, you see that even though both of these learners were absolute novices, they already demonstrated huge inter-individual differences. But if you compare that to an expert, right, the differences become even larger. Right, so the wrist velocity is entirely different for an advanced learner than it is for a novice learner, but it is even different between novice learners. So that shows that everyone's trying to find a different functional movement solution to the problem of taking a set shot. And I'll just show you this, and what I want you to do is I want you to just look out for the inter-individual differences that exist. This is, if I'm correct, this is frisbee golf or disc golf, where the very first throw has to be a throw that's as far as possible. So let's take a look at all these experts in this particular discipline and how different all of their movements are. Oh, that doesn't seem to roll. Let me just see. Anyway, you can take a look at it in your own PowerPoint presentation, but basically you can see that there's vast differences in how all of these experts throw the frisbee, even though the task goal is exactly the same. So again, if we see this sort of inter-individual variability in experts, we definitely see it in novices. So you can see that everyone's trying to solve the movement problem, find a functional movement solution that matches their intrinsic dynamics. Some of these throwers have long limbs, others shorter limbs, some are more athletic, some are more technical, etc. So in a practical setting, it is absolutely important that we try to deal with these individual differences as much as possible. Right, so an individual approach is the most effective in skill acquisition. But usually we don't just have one athlete, but we have 30 athletes, just like you in your peer instruction session. So figuring out ways in which we can get an individual approach to happen, or ways in which we can deal with individual differences in large groups is obviously quite challenging. If you look at one of the most commonly reported individual differences, they are maturity-related differences. And for those of you who don't know where maturity-related differences come from, if you look in the top right, we can actually see the growth velocity of girls and boys. Right? And everyone knows girls get their growth spurt earlier than boys do, where girls, it's between 11 and 12 years in general, and for boys it's between 13 and 14 years. And that adolescent growth spurt often leads to huge inter-individual differences in stature and body size in general, because if you look at that picture there, these two children are the same age, they play in the same age category, but obviously one of the children is much heavier and much taller than the other. Yeah? So there are huge inter-individual differences that are not necessarily related to someone's skill level either. They can be related to someone's body size differences, right? So it's not just dealing with different skill levels that's important for practitioners, it's also dealing with huge inter-individual differences in body size, right? And one way that experts or coaches or practitioners often try to deal with individual differences is by trying to give expert demonstrations. But we've already said expert demonstrations, what they really do is they try to give everyone an idealized image of a movement, right? So in traditional learning methods, we were commonly told that we should be using demonstrations or expert demonstrations as a method to get a particular movement behavior across to our learners, right? Of course, now we know that individuals in a group may not all benefit from a demonstration equally, because that demonstration will match the intrinsic dynamics of some, but will mismatch the intrinsic dynamics of others. So Hodges and Franks argued it this way: ability level will affect what information an athlete is able to extract during a demonstration. And as expertise develops, the nature of the perceptual variables or informational constraints that performers use to support movements will differ considerably. So again, that highlights that every single learner, from a constraints-led perspective, uses demonstrations in a different way, and it will all depend on their own intrinsic dynamics. So coaches and teachers should really identify the nature of information that learners acquire so that they can match the content and the presentation of visual information during a demonstration so that it enhances skill acquisition. So demonstrations are most useful during the early stages of learning, and they should convey, rather than an idealized motion or an idealized image of what a skill looks like, they should convey relative motion information that is essential for the assembly of a basic pattern. Yeah, so we call that an in-the-ballpark coordination pattern. Demonstrations also should not aim to promote replication and imitation of a model. And learners might benefit more from other learners at similar skill levels who provide demonstrations, because we said that in motor learning last year, is that when novices provide demonstrations, it actually gives other novices an idea of which movement qualities do not work. It tells them what not to do. So really a demonstration, as we mentioned before, should be used to guide the search for an approximate movement solution, so that rather than having to search the entire perceptual motor landscape, the learner now only searches part of that perceptual motor landscape. So we should use demonstrations to guide learning. Another thing that can be used to match the intrinsic dynamics of learners is something called body scaled equipment, right? So practitioners can accelerate learning by manipulating task constraints such as the size and the mass of equipment. And it allows every learner to match their intrinsic dynamics with the task requirements. For example, you could give a heavier baseball bat to a stronger player, while you'll give a lighter baseball bat to a less strong player. Or a player who's reasonably skillful and tall can play at a higher volleyball net than a learner who's less skillful or a lot smaller. And that will all result in functional movement solutions being found by the learners. And this is supported by empirical research. Beek, Davids, and Bennett demonstrated that if you use 10-year-old novice tennis players and you ask them which of these rackets would you use to hit your maximum distance with a forehand drive, then they saw that these learners automatically selected rackets that were more suitable to their age range, so with weight distributed more towards the handle. So learners are actually really good at matching intrinsic dynamics with the task requirements that allow them to provide functional movement solutions. And similar research demonstrated that when learners used balls that were too big or too heavy to kick, grasp, and throw, it actually led to decrements in skill acquisition. And 66% of all 10-year-old basketball players actually prefer a smaller basketball when shooting over an adult-sized ball. So learners are really good at figuring out which equipment they would need so that they can match their intrinsic dynamics with the task dynamics. And that is something that's really easy to do for practitioners, because you could provide different types of body scaled equipment or different heights of volleyball nets that allow learners to figure out which one of those allows them to figure out functional movement solutions in the most efficient manner. So because people learn at different rates, practice organization should always be flexible enough to deal with those variations, right? But the question is how? How can practitioners in these large groups of people deal with individual variation in a practical manner? Well, first of all, is they can delegate practice organizations to the learner. So rather than telling the learners which types of practice or which practice they are going to do exactly, they can encourage peer-led play over coach-led practice. Let the learners figure out the ways in which they learn best. Another way of doing it is they can organize learning based on competency groups, right? They can split up the group and provide different competency groups. So learners who are better at the task versus learners who are not as good at the task, with different types of learning or different types of practice. You can also use something called criterion-based learning. Yeah, so rather than setting out a particular criterion, for example, let's play this game for 10 minutes, you ask the learners to set out a criteria. Now, for example, they want to be able to stand on their hands for at least 2 seconds without falling in a handstand. Right? So you can actually use criterion-based learning that uses different criteria than the most common ones, such as, whoever gets to 5 goals first wins, or let's play this game for 10 minutes. We set out different criteria. And then finally, we should always allow for and encourage individual variation in finding functional movement solutions. So rather than chasing that idealized movement, we really should allow our learners to explore which functional movement solution matches their intrinsic dynamics best. And delegating practice organization to the learners themselves is not that difficult, right? And we often use something called a probing conversation. So the coach would have all the learners around and he would ask or she would ask questions such as, why do you think you lost the ball that often? Right? And the learners might say, well, we didn't pass it quick enough. You were trying to hang on to the ball too often. And then the coach might ask, all right, so how would we be able to solve this? And they would say, well, by moving the ball around a lot quicker. And the coach might ask, all right, so give me one manipulation to the small-sided game that we could use to get that to happen. And one of the learners might say, well, we can only hold on to the ball for 3 seconds. If we hold on to it longer, it goes to the opposition team. And in doing so, the learners actually delegate practice based on what they think is valuable for them as a group. And I put this video in here because we as practitioners, as adult practitioners, always think that we have to direct practice, but that's not the case. Kids are actually extremely good at directing practice themselves. In this particular example, these children on the beach, they were just making their own game. Everyone's playing with everyone. There's some bigger kids there, there's some younger kids there, and they make up their own game. They do dancing squares. They make up their own rules. Sometimes it tackles a foul, sometimes it's not. The kids are actually right? So we don't always have to design their practice. Kids are very good at understanding what kind of practice is beneficial to them. In this case, a few slightly heavier kids, they make a much smaller ground. Right? So rather than making a ground over 40 meters, they've made it a lot smaller. Kids are very, very good at matching the task dynamics with their intrinsic dynamics. Here's some examples of how you can develop competency groups. Right? So one group who's actually really advanced in learning might work entirely separately without a coach, and they are working in a small-sided game, and they don't use any instructor feedback, but they just use peer feedback. So one of their peers, who might be a substitute player, gets to give feedback after 5 minutes before then moving into the game themselves. Another group might use, or a less skilled group might use a regression where they use coach video feedback whenever they request it. So the coach is filming them, and when they request it, they can see feedback of their own performance. And just for your information, only in 11% of trials, usually novice players actually request to use feedback. And finally, something else that we can do is we can really allow for individual variation in finding functional movement solutions. So rather than telling this child how to get to the other side exactly, the only thing we say is get the ball to the other side without being touched. And how a learner solves that movement problem is up to them. So of course you can use this case study at home and try to figure out the best possible answer to this from your perspective. But what we saw in this lecture is that intrinsic dynamics that match the task demands lead to accelerated learning. And if there's a discrepancy between intrinsic dynamics and task demands, learning usually occurs slower. Genetics are definitely not the blueprint for success in sport, and there's a huge role to be played by the cultural or the nurture aspect. Practitioners have a variety of ways of dealing with individual differences in ability, and it usually takes some creativity from a practitioner to really do that well. And then Talent identification is a process that takes advantage of identifying individual differences in performance early. We didn't see that in this particular lecture, so we can forget about that for the moment. All right, thank you.